University Avenue, One Street, 1,000 Dreams is a Minnesota Partnership co-production of Ramsey County Historical Society and Twin Cities Public Television. Funding is provided in part by the State of Minnesota from the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund through the Minnesota Historical Society. Additional funding is provided by the Bigelow Foundation, Huss Foundation, Sewell Family Foundation, and by the following.
When I visited University Avenue for the first time, I thought it might compete for the ugliest avenue in America.
University Avenue was the hub. Everything that was anything was on University Avenue.
There's no question that the freeway killed the commercial corridor.
University Avenue is the Highway 66 of the Twin Cities. The freeway has taken the traffic, but it's still there.
It's a place of people of many colors, many ethnicities, many traditions.
The University Avenue has always been a home for immigrants, and it'll go on forever. This is a forever process, and it's healthy.
Rents are reasonable. It allows people who have dreams to start.
The thing that concerns me about University Avenue is that the cost of land there continues to go up.
Here we tore up the streetcar tracks, and now we're putting down light rail.
Whenever you build a $957 million project, a certain amount of dislocation is going to result from that.
I'm walking by a lot of small storefronts that are vacant.
This is where people want to be, so it really bodes well for the Avenue. University Avenue's best days are still to come.
It's really an amazing street if you take the time to learn it and see who's on it and who uses it day to day.
There are big box retailers, there's mom and pop stores, there's condominiums, there are families who have lived there for many generations, and there are people from all over the world. No matter how you think about urban life, socioeconomically, ethnically, culturally, spiritually, it's all there.
University Avenue means different things to different people. It's always been eclectic, unruly, noisy, gritty. And the street has seen its fortunes rise and fall over the decades. But its purpose has always been the same, to provide a vital link between Minneapolis and St. Paul for people and commerce. As Europeans began settling here in the early 19th century, they needed to establish a connection between the port of St. Paul and the falls of St. Anthony, where the industrial site would develop. A map from the 1830s shows a walking trail connecting those 2 points, and it ran along the approximate alignment of University Avenue.
The early travelers were looking for the shortest distance between the two locations. And University, or that corridor, is approximately the shortest route. And University Avenue has had this same connecting function between the Falls, or downtown Minneapolis, and the port, or downtown St. Paul, through the whole history of the urbanization and settlement of this area.
The first institutions that developed along University were also responsible for giving the street its name. The University of Minnesota, founded in 1851, reopened at its present campus in 1867, and Hamline University relocated from Red Wing to St. Paul in 1880. Back then, University Avenue ran along the southern edge of the Hamline campus. University was later moved a half-mile to the south to accommodate the Minnesota Transfer Railway. As the two universities were developing, so was the rivalry between Minneapolis and St. Paul, although University Avenue offered an opportunity for the two cities to work together.
The two cities, of course, had been bitter rivals prior to even thinking about something like University Avenue. But in 1873, leaders of the business associations in both Minneapolis and St. Paul came up with the idea that what the two cities needed was something to help unify, help bring the two cities together. And they proposed a wonderful broad boulevard that would link the two downtowns, and they called it Broad Avenue. And their vision was a street that had 660 feet right-of-way with a commuter steam rail line going right down the middle, connecting the two downtowns, and flanking the rail line would be linear parks of some 100 feet wide on both sides, just an enormous boulevard. That vision did not happen. Things were moving pretty quickly. They needed to make the connection between the two cities, and a much smaller, scaled-down version was introduced, still fairly significant in size, 120 feet wide, which is a very, very wide right-of-way.
Early travelers along that right-of-way would have traveled by foot or on horseback. But as the two downtowns developed, people needed a faster means of getting from one to the other. The era of the steam railway was taking hold across America. By the early 1880s, commercial rail service connected the two cities.
Prior to the coming of the electric line, the way you got between downtown Minneapolis and downtown St. Paul was over one of 3 steam railroads. And each of those 3 railroads had hourly trains between the Twin Cities that served a series of intermediate stations about every mile between the cities.
Ambitious real estate developers soon bought up large pieces of land around these stations and marketed these areas with their winding streets and lush foliage as picturesque residential neighborhoods for the growing merchant class.
Most money is made when land is changed from rural to urban. That's when the biggest jump in value occurs. So those guys knew that, and they set out to create some suburbs.
They were viewed as suburban developments, even though technically they weren't suburbs. They were in the city limits. But these were railroad suburbs where you would be accessible to the city via the commuter train, but you didn't have to be in the city. It was much more peaceful. St. Anthony Park is one of those. McAllister Park is one. Miriam Park, which is on University Avenue, is another one.
Miriam Park was boosted as going to be the center of the metropolitan area on University Avenue.
These were kind of high-end residential lots that were sold and marketed quite successfully.
I think it's not an exaggeration to say that many real estate developers and businessmen and politicians looked at University Avenue as kind of the goose that lays the golden egg, that there's going to be a lot of action here and we're going to make a lot of money and have a great time.
One of the most important industries contributing to this boom was the railroad industry, and the Twin Cities was ideally positioned as a critical hub for the independent lines that came in from across the country.
There were 9 privately owned railroads coming in from all directions around the country and did not really have an opportunity to efficiently transfer freight from one rail company to another. James J. Hill had the idea of actually consolidating all of the transferring activities in one place, and he selected Pryor and University.
The Minnesota Transfer Railroad that connected them all was a critical idea, and those guys, when they had an idea, they made them happen. I mean, they didn't shilly-shally around talking about stuff. They did it.
And that was an enormously effective tool for creating efficiency and economic development. They could actually very efficiently and effectively transfer freight from one company to another, and then it would go on its way around the country. And of course, with the concentration of rail activity, a variety of other businesses could then start to cluster around there.
One of those first companies was Brooks Brothers Lumber, a major business that relied on the railroad to ship lumber from its mills in the Northwest. Materials being unloaded in St. Paul needed to get to local customers, creating a need for freight companies. Banks, hardware stores, and other businesses contributed to the dynamic industrial center in the Midway area. Another major activity that evolved during the late 1800s was the horse brokerage. These businesses clustered around the Minnesota Transfer, where they could unload their horses being shipped in from the west. One of the most colorful characters was Moses Zimmerman, who ran the largest horse brokerage in the region.
Moses Zimmerman and the other horse brokers at Pryor and University Avenue flourished all over the region. This would be the place where people would come for horses, not just individual farmers, but we're talking about commercial fleets that would need horses for their trucking business, fire departments, police departments. We're talking sales on a massive scale, tens of thousands of horses a month.
Zimmerman's business enjoyed one last burst of activity during World War I, when he became the largest supplier of horses and mules to the U.S. military. But Old Nellie's days were numbered. A new form of transportation was taking hold, right on University Avenue. In 1913, Henry Ford began assembling Model Ts in a handsome new building near the state capitol. At the other end of the avenue, an impressive factory began building the Willys Overland, one of the Model T's competitors. That complex was converted to manufacture airplanes and train mechanics during World War I, and later became a factory and warehouse for International Harvester. Cars were still a novelty in the early 20th century, but in the late 1870s, creative businessmen had started building small horse-drawn streetcar lines in scattered areas around town. One of them was run by a young real estate mogul named Thomas Lowry, who had visions of linking them all together into one system. When the electric streetcar was finally perfected in 1888, he seized the opportunity. He saw the modern streetcar as a powerful tool to enhance the value of the adjacent real estate, some of which he owned himself.
In St. Paul, they put in the first line on Grand Avenue in 1889. The next line that they built was University Avenue between Minneapolis and St. Paul in 1890, and they called it the Interurban.
In a story reporting on the huge crowds on opening day, the Pioneer Press proclaimed that it was as if the two cities had just exchanged their entire populations. The streetcar line accelerated the growth of University Avenue. Thousands of workers rode it to their jobs at the railroads and factories along the corridor and to the mills in Minneapolis. By 1906, hundreds of them were also working at the Snelling Avenue shops, where Lowry had just built a factory to manufacture his own streetcars.
Thomas Lowry basically decided that the commercial products that were out there were not up to Minnesota winter conditions. And so he decided that they would build their own. And the Twin Cities streetcar system alone, among all North American streetcar systems, built all its own streetcars.
Those cars were all needed to keep up with the demand for transportation, especially along the University Avenue corridor, which had become the busiest route in the system.
The Interurban ran frequently. It was generally at least every 10 minutes. And as the city grew, and the fact that basically everyone was riding the streetcars, the demand grew and grew and grew. Eventually, they got down to about 3-minute frequency on University Avenue, and during the rush hour, it would be 1-minute frequency. There would essentially be a streetcar almost every block.
In the decades following World War I, University Avenue's industrial growth really kicked into high gear. Anchored by the railroad industry, the street became a magnet for companies involved in lumber, trucking, printing, and all sorts of manufacturing.
University Avenue is a place where things were built. If you start at the International Court Building, originally cars were manufactured there. Waldorf cardboard boxes were built. Griggs Cooper's candy was made. Brown and Bigelow calendars were made. It was a place built to manufacture, and the infrastructure showed that. Big streets, access to rail, proximity to workers. It was really set up as a true heavy industrial area. The large businesses dominated the streets where the traffic occurred. It's where the employment happened. They were businesses that you could depend on. They were businesses that had almost uninterrupted growth. They were businesses who hired employees for a lifetime.
Many of those workers were employed in the food processing industry at places like Ives Ice Cream Company and Minnesota Milk Company. Over in the Griggs Midway building, the Griggs Cooper Company packaged candy, popcorn, and other tasty treats. A mile to the west was the Twin City Wholesale Grocer Company, which sold its products under the Fairway Foods label. The company was a model of efficiency with modern conveyors and a revolutionary punch card system that controlled inventory and billing. This early computer system was made by Remington Rand, one of several computer makers that sprang up along the street in the mid-20th century. The growing use of electrical devices was good news for the White Enamel Refrigerator Company and Onan Generators, both of which became popular brands and major employers. The printing industry was booming across America, and University Avenue had its share of the action, with companies like Brown Blodgett, Bruce Publishing, and Curtis 1000. And then there was Brown and Bigelow, famous for its calendars with the artwork of Norman Rockwell. One of the company founders, Herbert Bigelow, achieved a different sort of fame in 1924 when he was convicted of tax evasion and sent to federal prison. After being pardoned by President Calvin Coolidge, he hired his former cellmate, Charlie Ward, to help run the company. Over the years, they employed hundreds of ex-convicts as a matter of company policy. Businesses of all kinds found University Avenue a profitable place to be. The streetcar system provided easy access for workers and customers, but it also left a permanent mark on the development of adjacent neighborhoods.
The streetcar lines had such an important impact on the way University Avenue developed, the major intersections where streetcar lines would cross approximately a mile apart, Dale, Lexington, Snelling, Fairview, Raymond, and the like. That's really where the cluster of development took place. So the streetcars were very, very important in terms of the way it shaped the land use patterns along University Avenue.
Although the automobile was beginning to gain popularity in the 1920s, the streetcar was still the best source of reliable, low-cost transportation. And it wasn't just used for getting to work.
My earliest memories of University Avenue were my freshman year at St. Thomas College, as it was then. I couldn't afford a bus ride. I mean, I couldn't afford certainly not a taxi to go to a movie downtown Minneapolis. But there was the streetcar that took us there. This was a liberating means of transportation.
By 1922, the Twin Cities streetcar system had grown to be one of the largest in the country, with over 500 miles of track. The interurban line was the spine of the system, and it helped make University a destination for shopping, dining, and entertainment. One of the most popular places was the Lexington Ballpark, which had opened in 1897 and remained active through the mid-50s.
The ballpark was on the southwest corner of Lexington and University. The St. Paul Saints were at a farm club of the Los Angeles Dodgers. That was a big deal. And then the Minneapolis Millers had a team as well, and they played over off of Lake Street, Nicollet Ballpark.
One of the features of the rivalry between the St. Paul Saints and the Minneapolis Millers was what came to be referred to as streetcar doubleheaders, where they would play a noon game or a late morning game in one of the two cities, and then everyone would pile on streetcars, and a couple hours later they would get to the other ballpark and they'd play, a late afternoon or an evening doubleheader.
But I went to many games in the old Lexington Ballpark, and behind left field on University Avenue was a roller rink. So if you had a home run over the left field fence and landed on top of the roller rink.
That roller rink was the Coliseum Pavilion Ballroom, which hosted all sorts of social events, including the legendary marathon dances. It advertised 25,000 square feet of dancing floor, smooth as glass. A young Louis Armstrong played there in 1939, and the place even had its own band, Wally Erickson's Coliseum Orchestra, which was featured in the first phonograph recording ever made in St. Paul. Around the corner was the boulevards of Paris, with its elegant murals offering an illusion of European ambiance. Midway Gardens was another favorite spot. But the most famous of all was the Prom Ballroom, which opened in 1941. Close to 6,000 people were packed inside on opening night, and another 3,000 had to be turned away.
Many, many nights, they had to send out extra cars to pick up the people, to take them downtown to transfer on cars that go near their houses.
There were regular visits by traveling circuses that entertained thousands at Circus Hill, located where the Central Medical Building is today. Everybody from Buffalo Bill to Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey played to the eager crowds under the big top. If all this activity made you hungry, you could hop on the streetcar to visit the many bars, coffee shops, and restaurants up and down the avenue.
There was all kinds of eating places. You could go to a different one every day, and I think you wouldn't have hit them all in a month.
University Avenue had two of the best restaurants the city had, the Blue Horse and the Criterion. Wonderful restaurants and places where legislators gathered with lobbyists to make major decisions about the future of our state.
They'd help the mayor out of the Criterion at night. He had a little bit too much. They'd help him, and the chauffeur would come and pick him up.
Criterion, where Joan Smith played the piano, and she worked at KSTP and played the organ on a show we called Treasure Chest, and that's where she met Ray Kroc and became Joan Kroc, of McDonald's. He met her there.
If shopping was high on your agenda, you could find just about anything at the Mammoth Montgomery Ward building, which opened in 1920 as a distribution center for its thriving catalog business. Montgomery Ward was one of the most prominent establishments in the Twin Cities, occupying much of the land on the south side of University between Snelling and Hamlin Avenues.
We'd order things from Ward's. The catalog was our family Bible, and that's what we read together.
They'd write up your order, and they had this air chutes where they'd shoot your order up, and they'd go back, and then they'd tell you where to pick it up. And you see the girls roller skating back to different bends to bring your order up to you. Boy, and them girls were good, too.
The teenage girls would be flying on their roller skates. We've gotten several stories of girls imagining that they wanted to be on those roller skates, zooming around this huge building.
It was always a fascinating place because these people would come on their roller skates to deliver the things to the counter. So I looked forward to getting a job at Ward's. But I was put behind a little desk and went through file cards, writing down what people bought and keeping track of their orders. So working at Ward's wasn't as exciting as I thought it was going to be.
Montgomery Ward's was a place to go to buy clothing, to buy paint, to buy anything you needed. Actually, they sold automobiles back then.
I mean, the fact that Montgomery Ward was built as the premier shopping destination that it was says something about how University Avenue was held in high regard. Same thing with Lake Street and Sears. By the way, there's the reason that they were sited that way as opposed to being in the downtowns is that both those stores, besides being a retail store, were also shipping centers, distribution centers for Montgomery Ward and for Sears, and they featured first-class streetcar service at the front door so the customers could get to it, but they had direct railroad access at the back door so they could get the goods in for a low cost. And you couldn't actually do that in the downtown.
Mixed in among all the commercial activity were two pioneers in the film and television industry. Ray Bell Films was one of the oldest commercial filmmakers in the country. They made films for training and promotion, including several for the Minnesota Tourism Department. During World War II, they made more films for the U.S. Office of Education than any other company. And in 1948, KSTP-TV signed on the air, becoming the first commercial television station in the upper Midwest. It's also the only station with the Minneapolis-St. Paul property line running right through the front door. All these stories about streetcars, dance halls, and big businesses paint a very different picture of University Avenue than the images we can recall from more recent decades, when many people had decided to ignore it.
University, I think, is perceived much differently today than it was back then. And I think for the big streetcar strips of that era, back then they were mainstream. That's where everybody meant to go.
University had everything: car dealerships, drugstores, food stores.
Long before Grand Avenue, University Avenue was the hub. It was the place to be. Everything that was anything was on University Avenue.
Well, it was streetcars, and it was islands in the middle where you'd walk out in the island and wait for the streetcar. It was busy. It was Brown and Bigelow. It was Waldorf Paper. It was Midway Chevrolet. Down the other end, it was University of Minnesota. It was then what the freeway is today.
But the allure of the suburbs and America's love affair with the automobile spelled trouble for commercial corridors and streetcar systems everywhere. And the Twin Cities were no exception.
Following World War II, ridership dropped dramatically. During the war, there had been a tremendous resurgence of ridership because you had rationing of gasoline, new automobiles were not available for sale, rationing of rubber. So everyone got on the streetcars. After the war, all that pent-up demand for automobiles asserted itself, people started moving to the suburbs, ridership plummeted. The streetcar company was a profit-making enterprise. The only way they could stay in business was to carry enough people at enough fares so that they could cover their costs. All across the country, streetcar systems were being abandoned because streetcars cost more to run than buses. The streetcar company has to build and maintain all those tracks, and they owned 400 some miles of tracks.